So I've got 5:05. So
Okay.
let's start.
I want to thank the three of you that are here attending the workshop. This is a second in the series that we've had. And I feel like we're very fortunate because we've had other groups discussing year-round and workforce housing in the Mid-Coast. I want to recommend to you folks, the West Bay Rotary Club in Camden had two very good speakers in the last few weeks. Martin Cates of Cate Real Estate talking about the really tiny supply of available housing and the extreme escalation in prices for residential properties. And yesterday, Joe Cloutier, who's a local resident and developer of housing and manager for about 45 years, talked about the need to mobilize for workforce housing in the area. Both talks were recorded and are available on the Rotary's website. And Vicki Dudera of Camden also has done an affordable housing workshop. So today we have three developers and advocates of affordable housing, and they will speak about the possibilities in Mid-Coast Maine. We have Rebecca Hatfield from Avesta. She is the Vice President of Real Estate Development and Management. We have Cullen Ryan from Community Housing of Maine, or CHOM, and he's also a developer and advocate. He's the Executive Director. And last but not least, we have Brian Seitz from Volunteers of America in Northern New England, and they're located in Brunswick. So I'm going to let them go right ahead. Cullen started before. We also went around the room to see what people's interests were. So take it away, folks.
I can start again if that works for you too.
Sure.
All right, so what we did last time that seemed to help was to hear from who is here in the audience. So, and I think we each come with these PowerPoint presentations, and we could opt away from those and just have a conversation with you, because it seemed like the most important part was the dialogue that came afterwards. So, so why don't we just go around and find out who's here with us and what would be most useful to you in terms of discussion. I'm going to start at my lower right, Gretchen. Want to just explain who you are? And
hi everyone, nice to meet you. Gretchen Yeager. I own a business in Bath. My company is Halcyon and Yarn, and I'm also on the board of our Main Street Bath program and on the city's community development committee. So this is a topic that has come up for me in all three of those contexts, and I'm very interested to kind of just hear what people are thinking, and if it's useful, share my experience from those various realms.
great, thank you, Gretchen.
Cheers.
Susan, do you want to say?
Yeah, I don't know who's next for you, because, you know, on my screen, I'm not sitting next to Gretchen. So anyway, I am a reporter and assistant editor with Courier Publications, and I'm with the Camden Herald, which is our newspaper, and villagesoup.com, which is our online platform. I originally, you know, would have, if there was a larger group, I would have said that I'm simply here as an observer, and I don't necessarily have any questions. But I do sort of have a question, because I have been listening to town officials in Camden talk about the lack of affordable housing, and I've heard them come up with either different perceptions of what affordable housing is, or even possibly a unique, to me, definition of where a gap is in the type of housing that they need. So I'd be interested in hearing from all three. What is affordable housing? And, you know, what are you targeting? What income levels are you targeting? Basically, that's my question.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. And Marcy. You're muted, Marcy.
Marcy's muted.
Marcy, it might be on the bottom left if
yes,
you.
I know. I got it.
Okay.
Right.
Awesome. There, of course.
I attended the first workshop, and I'm very interested in this one. I'm on the town's 2020 comp plan that is now turned into 2021 because of COVID. And I'm I'm on a subcommittee that has affordable housing as its topic. And I've attended a number of webinars recently, one given by Augusta Housing, one given by someone from Coastal Land Trust in, it's the Melican Project that's outside in Waterville. And I've also been looking online. I particularly enjoyed the article that the Bath Housing did on your Levine project, and particularly was interested in the best practice section of that project. And I guess from that, I really would like to learn about best practices and what a town can do that's maybe different than what they're doing now, because affordable housing is a problem statewide, and it's particularly a problem in Brunswick as the Portland market is moving up and creating more of a problem for all of us north of Portland. And we don't want to be a bedroom community. We really want to be a multi housing community that can house our workers as well as our professionals and as well as first-time home buyers. So that's what I'm interested in.
Good. Well, thank you very much. And then the person who's AGF.
I don't know where I am, but anyway, I'm from Rockland, and I've been working with Rodney on a lot of housing issues in Rockland. And so I'm just here to listen. Thank you.
Great. All right. All right. Well, I will just take a stab at some of those first questions that were raised. Again, my name is Colin Wright. I'm with Community Housing Maine. We focus on affordable and supportive housing, which basically is affordable with services added. And we tend to target homeless and special needs populations. And I can go into details about that. But the question that came up was about what is affordable housing, and I'll just lay maybe we'll just kind of round robin these, but I'll just lay out the first concept. Affordability really varies across the country, and we happen to be in a part of the country where, because we have kind of small villages and communities that were based on villages and small towns that and it's beautiful locations. The land and the buildings are very dear, and we see parts of the country where a couple $100,000 can buy an awful lot of house, and here in Maine, where that's making it's even harder to find something that will work in many markets with that amount of money, and sometimes even more. We heard about Camden today with 700,000 to way over $1 million, and so that's our primary issue. So the other things that affect affordability are the operating costs of the building. So traditionally, a rental property is the ticket to affordability. Maine has a really high degree of home ownership, but I think that's going to be harder in certain markets for people who are to enter into, because the costs are shooting up so much. And so usually we're talking about rental housing, talking about affordable housing. And so the tools that we use essentially try to raise funds to create the bricks and mortar part of that building and make as much of those costs go away and essentially be subsidized, such that you're getting closer and closer to the perfect situation where you're just covering with rents the operating costs of the building. And the operating costs in Maine are higher than other markets because we have heat considerations. But our cost of building is higher than some other markets as well. We seem to be not far from the Boston labor market and that sort of thing, which drives things up higher. So what we are looking at is what can rent support in terms of operations. And so the problem there is that if you're looking at debt service on a building, which is a traditional landlord situation, we don't have much in the way of margins to cover that debt service and keeping the rents to be affordable for people who are earning in incomes that are considered low or even moderate. So, and certainly not for extremely low income populations and or very low above that. So I think that that's sort of a bit of a backdrop. When we start to get down to target this towards very low and particularly extremely low income populations, and this gets down to 50, 40, and then ultimately below 40% of area median income, we really are talking about needing a rental subsidy to help support somebody's income in order to pay their rent. What's considered affordable is paying 30% of somebody's income towards rent. And that's been a standard in place for the last 90 years. And what we see is a whole bunch of people in Maine, who are rent overburdened. They're paying closer to 50% of their incomes towards housing, and that's not sustainable. And it also means that people get stuck. They're unable to dig their way out of poverty because all their money is going to rent, and they don't have enough money to take care of the other needs that they have. So these are sort of obvious things, and I think many of you folks are probably well aware of that. But at least in Maine, we can't just make the building costs go away enough to have these be affordable for extremely low income populations. It just doesn't work. We can get down so far, and in many markets, we're just a little bit below what the market rate is, market rents are. So an affordable rent might just be a little bit below a market rent. In markets like Portland, affordable rents are considerably below what the market can bear. But I think that is a changing situation. So I will just leave it there and see what Rebecca and Brian have to add.
The only thing I would add is just the difference between, I think an important point is the difference between subsidized and unsubsidized housing. So unsubsidized housing, which you often hear about, tax credit housing or low-income housing, tax credit funded housing, is not subsidized. The units are income restricted at usually 60% of area median income and below, or 50% of area median income below, and then the rents are set based on those incomes. However, there's no subsidy going to the tenant paying a portion of their rent. So some of the challenges with tax credit housing is that someone needs to make enough money to afford the rent so they're not rent burdened, which Colin mentioned was more than 30% of their income, but they can't make too much because they won't qualify. So there's this band of affordability. Whereas in subsidized housing, which I think many people know, or they pay to Section 8 housing, like Section 8 vouchers, tenant-based vouchers, or project-based vouchers, that's actual rent subsidy that's going to the tenant. So they're income qualified, and then from there, the rent is determined based on 30% of their income, and the rest of the rent is paid through subsidy, through the voucher or the subsidy that will come to the owner. So the benefit of subsidized housing is that you can often do deeper targeting. You can, even though the unit may be restricted to someone who's at 50% of AMI or below, you can put someone in there that has no income because they're getting rental subsidy to actually pay their rent. And Colin, I don't know, Brian, if you want to add on to that. I know it's in terms of explaining it, if there's anything to add to kind of clarify it a little bit.
No, I think that's a really important distinction. And I think when we're talking to communities, that's the hardest thing to understand. And maybe the biggest misconception is that the community is going to bear the burden of that subsidizing of the affordable rents, but that's not how the funding mechanism works. I mean, we're working with federal agencies, with Maine State Housing Authority through these funding mechanisms that provide that subsidy. It's not a burden that the town itself will have to take on. So that's always a question we get when we start talking about subsidized housing versus unsubsidized housing. So it can be a very confusing thing to talk about with community members.
And I'll just add to what Brian's saying, that rental subsidies, there's only one rental subsidy that is actually paid for by the Maine budget, and that is the Bridging Rental Assistance Program, which is a mechanism of compliance for the consent decree targeting people with serious and persistent mental illness who used to be institutionalized, and it recognizes that people need housing in order to illness. So the BRAP subsidy targets about 1,000 people in Maine and is really pretty small. Section 8, for example, is totally funded by the federal government through HUD. There are about 12,000 vouchers in Maine. There's 26,000 people on the waiting list for those vouchers. And then the other is something called Shelter Plus Care, which is targeting people who are homeless, particularly who are chronically homeless. That also comes through HUD, through homeless assistance grants, but again, entirely funded through the federal government. So it's not a burden, as Brian said, on localities to have people be subsidized to be able to afford their rent. It actually is a benefit because that person now is in stable housing and able to really achieve all of the things within their capabilities. And I had in my presentation that there's a group of people who get stuck in homelessness that ricochet through our most expensive emergency systems when they are unhoused. And we found that when you house that same population, they no longer touch all these expensive emergency systems. So it's actually quite beneficial to get people housed. It's more expensive to keep them homeless. And so these rental subsidies really make the difference between somebody being housed or not being housed. The issue that we're encountering, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, is that people can have a rental subsidy to be able to help level the playing field for paying rent, but have nowhere to use it because there's no apartments available that will accept that rental subsidy. And so that's where we start to get into the tools that we use, like the low-income housing tax credit, which welcomes in people with rental subsidies and allows people to have stable places to live within their community. And it also is the mechanism for workforce housing, which seems to be the primary concern of the earlier group that we met with today. That where are people who work in the communities going to live, and how can we keep that vitality if all the housing stock is being snatched up? Any questions to follow up from that one? And I'll move on to the second one when we're done with this.
I have a question. I don't see the little hand raising icon.
You did just perfect, Susan. Thanks.
I also forgot to use my fancy auxiliary camera. I like to put it on, but I can't do that during the meeting, I guess. Could you just talk a little bit more about the definition of workforce housing? How is that defined? It's probably defined differently in different communities, but I think it's just pretty much understood that there's a huge problem with a lot of people not being able to live near where they work if they work in a coastal community, especially. I don't know much about anything off the coast, but in coastal communities that tend to be more expensive for rents and very, very expensive to buy a house. So these people who need this workforce housing probably absolutely cannot afford to buy a house, but they'd still like to live closer to where they work and can't. They can't afford to rent.
I'll take a stab at that first, Susan. It's a great question. I think that it's nomenclature and that we're talking about the same thing. What happens is that when people start to get this vision of affordable housing, we sometimes run into the not in my backyard group that say, we don't want to have poor people living in this town now, do we? And people will start to reject them. And so they think of affordable housing as some mechanism to bring poor people into their community. And in fact, it's a mechanism to make sure that people who were born and raised in the community and living and working within the community actually have a mechanism to be able to stay and remain in that community. So we've reframed it as workforce housing because that somehow communicates a different message that we're keeping people who are employed within the community able to live within the communities which they work. But really the mechanism, as Rebecca pointed out, is that if you set rents at 50 and 60% of area median income, it tends to capture a sliver of the population, which is people who tend to have jobs, doing things like, a salesperson or a nurse or a firefighter or a police officer or, somebody working in the sheriff's department or a nurse or a librarian. And these type of professions tend to pay in the band where if a person in those professions were to pay 30% of their income, it's going to be just about exactly what the rent is charged for these units. And so we often list these professions to help neighbors understand we're talking about people who live and work in your community here, not some scary population that's going to descend upon you. These are the folks that you go and see every single day. And that's just what their jobs pay. And this is what they need to have affordability in their areas. I hope that helps start distinguish, and I'll turn it over to Rebecca and Brian.
Yeah, so at VOA, we don't, we don't currently work with workforce housing. We're really focused more on affordable senior housing, as well as group homes for individuals with severe and persistent mental illness, as well as intellectual and developmental disabilities. However, there is, kind of building on this talk of workforce housing, there is a cliff that the state of Maine is facing around rural development properties, which encompasses a lot of this workforce housing, wherein I don't know all the nomenclature, but a lot of these units are aging, and they're in danger of being lost due to contractual obligations with USDA and the rural development of being taken off the market as affordable for individuals. So we have been looking at the RD property acquisition so that we can take over some of those properties and preserve. So there's two things happening. There's this absolute need for more workforce housing, but there's also this preservation of existing units that's happening in the background simultaneously. So that's something that our agency is looking at, and that's really all I can offer in the in the workforce housing realm at this point.
May I just jump into something Brian mentioned? One of the conversations we're having a lot of in Bath in terms of preserving the rental stock that's available is that we're seeing such a significant increase in desire for Airbnb, properties that would 5 years ago would have gone into just regular long-term, sign a year lease rentals. And now we're seeing people scooping up properties right and left and converting them to short-term rentals. So I know a lot of other communities are struggling with that as well. And sort of in conjunction with that, we're looking at how to encourage people to do better development of ADUs. So just to increase the stock, particularly in our more densely zoned areas. But it's really challenging because I know, at least in Bath, and I know this is happening everywhere, we're seeing just the sale of homes that would have been either starter homes or rental properties just move out of reach so fast that it's pretty head spinning right now.
Yeah, so that's, I think, a perfect segue to that second question that was raised earlier, and what can towns do? And so in answer to that, towns can start to contemplate, do they want to turn over all of the, much of the housing stock to entrepreneurs that can rent that out without living within it, because that changes the fabric of what's going on in a locality. And it's been a challenge for municipalities to try to sort that out and figure out what to do. But some have put constrictions on that and say you have to, you can do an Airbnb, but you've got to also live within the property itself. So you don't have people from out of state who own a whole bunch of buildings, rent them out, and they're off the market for everybody else except tourists. And so that's one. Accessory dwelling units is another, and there's actually a bill that was being heard this afternoon. The Maine Affordable Housing Coalition weighed in on that talks about trying to make the world safe for accessory dwelling units, ADUs, and saying that we can really increase the stock through density. And one of the best ways to do that is to make it easy for somebody to have a small unit or something in their backyard, or connected to their house, an in-law type of apartment, that can go to rent to people in the area, and increase the stock pretty significantly. And the third we spent a lot of time talking about today was the tools that developers need in order to bring this housing in. And that includes zoning that allows density, so that you can have more, an apartment building with a number of units in the center of a downtown area, the heart of the community, so folks can walk around to what they need to. We need to have sort of a dense development to make the numbers work and fit underneath the funding tools that we have, the mechanisms. And TIFs, tax incremental financing, those are seen to be necessary at this point to sort of allow us to have, to make the numbers work as well, or being successful in getting the resources to develop this housing in the first place. All those are all things that folks can have, but also saying, hey, we want to craft a way to be welcoming to everybody, including people with limited incomes, including folks on fixed incomes and folks that are working in jobs that don't necessarily pay enough to buy an $800,000 house in Camden or whatever else, but decide that they're going to ensure that there will be a continuum of housing that is inclusive of people with limited incomes. And one last tool that I'd throw out before I turn it over is that it's sometimes possible for towns to do a little bit of land banking and saying, hey, we've got this municipal garage that is in terrible condition, and it's in the heart of the downtown area, and I mean that's not a good place to store salt and have trucks coming in and out of as we grow and change and develop as a community, and maybe that's better placed out here, and we can turn that land over to housing that's better placed right here in downtown, and so they can hold on to that land and actually create incentives for folks to come in and turn that into affordable housing. So things like that the municipality can be very proactive and actually open doors to the kind of housing that it wants, but it seems to take a team approach of the town working to stimulate affordable housing development for it to actually occur.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in there on kind of building off of what the importance of working with the towns very closely, and the towns understanding what it takes for us to put together one of these developments. I mean, there is no one funding mechanism that we're going to be going after at any given time to fund either a rehab development of an existing building, or a new construction. It takes multiple funding sources. So working with the town and understanding that, we're not going to work necessarily at the same pace as a private developer. It does take a while to put these funding sources together, and in understanding anything that the town can do to help us on that, fill those funding mechanisms, fulfill those funding mechanisms is greatly appreciated.
And I would echo exactly what Colin and Brian said. The one thing that I would add on to that, which I think Colin mentioned in the earlier session, is the advocacy part of it, which is a little more, doesn't have the direct impact, but is critically important for us to be able to do what we do. And that is to going to Maine Housing and telling them what you need. So if it is workforce housing, if it's 1 bedrooms for younger people or for single moms and dads, or telling them that's what your community needs, because they form the programs, they allocate the money, and they need to know what the towns in Maine are required to serve their residents. And so I think that advocacy piece is really, really important, reaching out to the state level and helping them understand what the community is saying and what the community needs from an affordable housing perspective or supportive housing perspective.
I see Molly and Bev, and we all introduced ourselves before, so I would love it if you would say anything about what answers you're looking for or questions you might have for the developers here tonight. Molly?
Hi, I live in Camden, and I'm just part of the group trying to figure out how we might make housing a little bit more affordable. So just listening in to see what ideas you might have.
And Bev, did you want to say anything or introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. I live in Rockland and we're going through developmental issues right next door to me, where the property is 10.5 acres and they claim it's for affordable housing. They want to put tiny houses there. And so I'm trying to decide what is this new thing that we're looking at, and how can I navigate this new thing that is propping up all over the place. I've heard of workforce housing in certain circles, and I never really thought it was a great thing, but perhaps I can just sit here and listen. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for being here.
If I could just ask a quick question of Bev, I'm curious. We've been having a lot of conversation. I live in Bath, and we've been having a lot of conversation recently about sort of the language we use to describe different types of housing, and also the people for whom that housing is intended. And one of the things that's come up a lot is this sort of trying to get our heads around the vocabulary. So I'm really curious when you say you're not sure about how you feel about a workforce housing, which is sort of a somewhat newer terminology. And I think there's a lot of potential confusion or sort of like people aren't all on the same page about what these things mean or why they even feel the way they do about them. So I'm just really curious where you're coming from with that, because we've been having a lot of discussion about that in my community. And I guess that's to everyone as well, but since you'd mentioned it, I just thought I'd stir the pot a little bit there.
Are you hearing me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, long time ago, I did some digging into some of the newest things coming out of some governmental agencies. And when they spoke about workforce housing, a lot of it tended to be connected to a China type of high rises and very small, tiny, little, barely livable areas. And that's kind of where my mind comes into the discussion of not desirable housing. And when it does come to the small houses, the tiny houses, as I call them, because they're asking for new code enforcement changes, which to my mind doesn't fit, and to my neighbors' minds doesn't fit with our community. So I guess that's the best explanation I can give you is has the terminology actually changed, or does it mean the same thing?
Well, Bev, I want to thank you for being clear about that. And I will tell you, just to put it out there, that I probably get calls once a week about somebody who has a great idea of creating tiny houses to sort of solve the issues for homeless populations or the shortage of housing. And I honestly am not, I'm a non-believer in tiny houses as being a solution for our affordable housing crisis, even though you can create a tiny house for what seems to be a small amount of money. We have to think in terms of all the infrastructure needs of that one building. So you're talking about 4 walls, 1 roof, some sort of a mechanism for heat, some mechanism to get water to this, house and sewer out of it, some mechanism to get electricity there. You're going to have a lot of other systems, driveways, parking, some mechanism to walk there. And that takes a certain amount of land to create. Unlikely are you going to see tiny houses that are wall to wall, so they're going to have some space around them. So what you're talking about is sort of a sprawl design that is going to be all on 1-story level for housing. That presents a challenge in terms of use of space that I think is better solved by a multi-family apartment building. And that is a building that often has 4 walls, 1 roof, and one ability to get, one mechanism for getting water into it, one mechanism for getting sewer out of it, electricity that comes in, and a place for people to park. So it's all the same infrastructure, but that one set of infrastructure now serves, 10, 20, 30, 40 people. And you are maximizing the use of space. And maybe Rebecca can show her slide, but she has a great example of some housing that could easily be workforce housing. It happens to be serving people who are over 55, but it sort of shows how a rather small building using a rather small footprint can serve a lot of people. I think it's 28 units, and you can sort of envision this sitting where now there would be, say, 2 houses or 3 houses on a street, and suddenly there's 28 people able to live in a building that doesn't have a very big footprint and is not, what you described about China, some sort of high rise. We don't see those in Maine. That's not what people are aiming for or what people want. What seems to fit into small communities, and this is one in Yarmouth, is a building like this. And I'll turn it over to you, Rebecca, if you want to just take us through this, but I think this is a great example. Rebecca, are you?
I'm having technical trouble.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
It's the world of Zoom.
Yes.
So sure, I can go through this quickly. As Colin mentioned, this is a building in Yarmouth. We completed it in 2017. It was a partnership with the town of Yarmouth and Yarmouth Senior Housing, which is a single purpose nonprofit in which the board members are citizens of Yarmouth. And both the nonprofit and the town saw the need for affordable housing. So we all kind of came together to make this happen in different ways. It is new construction. It provides apartment homes for older adults, 55 and over. There's a total of 28 units. They're mostly 1-bedrooms, but we also have a handful of 2-bedrooms in there as well. All the units are ADA accessible or adaptable. And the units are income restricted to those at 60% of area median income or below. And the rent includes utilities. To talk about some of the features of the community, as you can see from the picture, you may be able to see there's solar on the roof to help offset energy. There's also other energy efficient features. We have a large community room with a small kitchenette for gatherings. And then we have a large outdoor patio area, which many of the residents use. It's in a pretty prime location in Yarmouth, and it's right near town, walkable to town center, which I think Brian and Colin both mentioned is really important for affordable housing, having that accessibility to activities of daily living. And some of the services that we provide, ancillary services that we provide to the residents, are health clinics through Maine Health, so flu shot clinics, blood pressure clinics. There's free telemedicine services through Sensio Systems. We have a partnership with Southern Maine Agency on Aging to provide various services. There's a local community group that provides free daily rides to the grocery store or to doctor's appointments. We also have a resident service coordinator that will help residents connect to local services like Meals on Wheels. And then we provide financial education classes that are geared towards older adults, such as fraud avoidance and learning how to budget on a fixed income. And then the last thing I would say, which I'll mention just because it came up in the last session, it was one of the questions that was presented to us, I think, prior to the session, was we did end up renting to several residents that were local to the community or in surrounding communities. And although when we lease, we cannot put a preference for residents within the community, we certainly can do an on the ground effort from a marketing perspective. So, you know, we'll post in the library or at grocery stores, we'll connect with local community groups, we'll talk to the town to make sure that the residents are aware that this is being built and it's going to come on at a certain line and, you know, they should get on the interest list. So there's a huge effort to make sure the word is getting out to the community. And it's been very successful in the past to make sure that it's serving the residents who are already living in that community. And then occasionally you have people who want to, you know, they moved out of Yarmouth to another place for a period of time and now they want to come back because that's where their family is. And this presents an opportunity for them to do that.
Right. And if you picture this, I was there at the opening. It's a beautiful building. And I just, in terms of this footprint, I would think you might be able to stick 6 tiny homes on that site with adequate, you know, 15-foot buffers around them and that sort of thing. Or maybe 3 single-family homes that were tightly knit, you know, and you know, kind of a close, you know, proximity to another. Or you can have 28 homes that has, as you can see in the pictures, a really nice kitchen, a really nice living room, really nice dining area, you know, a nice bathroom, individual bedrooms, laundry, parking, a lot of other amenities that come with this from being able to connect with neighbors and support services and everything else. And this can be a value add to the community. Whenever we build these type of things, property values actually go up nearby. They are nice buildings that keep looking nice 100 years later by their design. And so they're well managed. So this is what we're often talking about is having a building like this. And Yarmouth is not a huge town, and this part of Yarmouth is not densely populated or anything else. And yet, you know, living here, somebody can walk to everything they need to have for their daily use. So this is, I think, a good example.
The last thing I would add on to that about the, you know, is Colin alluded to, you're not seeing high density, tall buildings. When we go into towns, and I think when all of the affordable housing developers go into towns, we have conversation, and it's a very thoughtful design process to make sure that it fits in with the fabric of the neighborhood that's surrounding where we're going to build or the greater community. You know, we're working on projects right now in Gray, in Freiburg, in Conway, New Hampshire, and there's a lot of community output about building something or input about building something that fits in to the community and looks like it's a part of it. And although some of those sites happen to be right next to residential neighborhoods, what we're building very much fits into that. So, you know, New England style buildings that only have 2 or 3 floors. We look at the siding and the color and the landscaping. So you're not going to have, you know, a high density urban building sitting in the middle of many of the towns in Maine. I think Portland is one of the only places that we see developments like that. But everywhere else, they tend to look just like this.
Bev, is that helpful to you? Well, at any rate, are there other questions that folks have that we could talk about that would be helpful to you.
Okay, so I'm sorry that I couldn't
Okay.
get it unmuted in a timely fashion. I was very happy to hear that you're not an advocate for tiny houses. It's been a problem with our community, and I'd be happy to have you come to our city council meeting in Rockland and voice that, but I doubt that you would. I also found it very, very interesting. The picture said Bartlett Woods, and that's the exact name of our nearby housing for the elderly. And we welcomed them. Unfortunately, this newest development is not welcoming. It's not with the character of our street, our community. And unfortunately, the funding is coming from Maine State Housing, and it doesn't seem to be stoppable. It just doesn't fit. But thank you for letting me speak about it.
And there are obviously different opinions, so I just am putting out mine. But I think that there are certain applications where it can work, and I think our closest example of that is the accessory dwelling units. Somebody could have a tiny house in their actual backyard that wasn't there before, that can increase the supply of housing. That could be very feasible. But 10 acres and putting a whole bunch of them on there is not necessarily the best use of space. So. All right, other questions that folks have that could help us to.
Could we have one more voice here? My husband would like to ask.
Yeah, I've been listening here. I'd like to add a couple of comments. With regards to the development that she's been talking about that's bordering our property, it's an area which was declared as wetlands and undevelopable many years ago when we were offered to purchase it. We looked into it, was told by the city that you could not build on it because of the wetlands. The issue with it right now is we know that it's going to be developed at some point, but the fact that the state can provide a grant in order to bypass regulations that the ordinary citizens have to comply with and allow them to develop on a property that is not developable by a private individual goes against my grain. The other is that this is not just a regular development. It is a prototype, which is apparently the first one being done, where they're going to be combining tiny houses in very tight clusters in turning over the operation to the homeless coalition. Then they're going to be building the Habitat for Humanity is going to be building some units that they're just going to be renting and other units that they will then pass on to the new owners. This is all in an area which has no other such a development near to it. So it is totally out of character with the houses that are there. And almost universally, the neighbors abutting the property and near it are all against it. But we seem to have no voice because the state and the federal government have created regulations that says they can do what they can do, that the rest of us cannot. And it does not fit in with the local development. So that it really goes against my grain. And it's got a lot of people very upset.
Well, thank you. It sounds like a frustrating situation, and best I can do is to speak in generalities about use of space. But what other questions do folks have?
This Mary Jane West. Have you ever done any mixed use developments? Because I thought about Rockland, and we have some there are a couple of shopping centers that have way too much parking area, and they kind of, because of it, they're kind of divorced from some of the development, like Hannaford Plaza. If there was mixed use housing, like housing on the top and commercial on the bottom, it would almost unite the whole village area better than it does now. Because if you walk, you have to get through this huge parking area to try to get to the store. And I think it might be more inviting to walkers if there was some kind of mixed use housing there. Not that the owners wants to do that, but it's sort of an infill housing that would be really close to shopping. So have any of the developers ever done anything like that?
Rebecca, you're probably the most likely to answer this.
Yeah.
We have not.
So we have done very few mixed use. You don't see them very often. They can be done, but because of the mechanisms of how tax credit projects are structured from an ownership entity perspective, it's very hard to do retail or commercial on the bottom. And so a lot of times if we are doing mixed use, the bottom commercial component is going to be owned by an entity and will be separate from the residential portion. And then you have to have a different ownership entity for the top portion of the building, which makes it difficult. There's also a lot of risk with commercial right now, office and retail. And so you don't want a residential building that's affordable housing taking on the risk of commercial space. And so it's not that it's impossible, it's just much harder to structure. And it's the reason why I'm thinking of maybe we've done it twice potentially. And actually we just had a building in South Portland that was going to have, we have one that is mixed use, but we were going to do the second phase with mixed use, and we took the retail portion out of it because it was too difficult.
I know it seems like now with COVID, it's almost, maybe turning commercial property into totally residential or something that might make more sense right now.
Yeah, I'll just add to what Rebecca's saying is that part of the reason is that our funding systems are siloed. So in other words, there's funding for affordable housing that comes through and has restrictions. You can only really include the part of the building that includes that housing in it. And so for you to start to involve capital that creates the retail space, there aren't resources for that are available to, say, nonprofit developers that are trying to create housing. So once that is taken on, there's a lot of challenge in terms of leasing that space up, as Rebecca was describing. And here's the situation where you picture of any village in Maine, and very often you have some sort of a store downstairs and the apartment, somebody living upstairs above it. I grew up in a town like that, and probably many of you did too. And ironically, it's, zoning keeps us from creating villages in most places, because you need to have so many acres for every single building. So it's illegal to create villages in most parts of Maine. And secondly, it's really challenging to recreate what we all think looks pretty good, which is to have this store on the bottom and people living above it. And so it is a conundrum.
I know, because of Rockland downtown has underutilized space on the top floors, and you think about Waldeboro that probably has the same kind of issue, but doesn't sound very likely at this point. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'd like to ask about mobile home parks, because they probably exist in multiple communities and sometimes pose issues for the community because of some of the owners of those parks don't always keep them very well. And it leaves a number of people with dilemmas, and yet they've chosen mobile homes as an alternative way to be able to afford some type of housing. So I'm wondering if any of you have experience with that and how you handle some of those issues.
Well, I can go early because I know very little, but that is to say that I know that the Genesis Community Loan Fund for a period of time was trying to assist with mobile home parks as an existing type of housing. And the way that it usually is that the person who lives in the mobile home has to rent the land that it sits on from a mobile park owner or something like that. And that can represent challenges because those costs can fluctuate. So what was affordable all of a sudden could change if the land underneath cost more money. And so they were working on trying to create cooperative mobile home parks where the ownership could be had by all of the neighbors together collectively. Turns out it's very difficult to do that. It's been done in Vermont and some other places, but and it's been done in Maine. But it's, again, very difficult and challenging to accomplish this. But it is a very real need that folks that are living there have a degree of affordability, and they're sort of at the mercy of a landowner that may not constantly have their interests in mind the way that they would. So that's about as far as I can go. Becca or Brian?
I got nothing on trailer.
I don't
Sorry.
have anything more than you. I sit on the Genesis board and they still are working. They still are helping mobile home communities convert to co-op, but it is extremely difficult and it requires technical assistance. It's the funding is complicated. So everything that Colin said, I have more to add to that.
Well, we've reached 6 o'clock. I don't know if there's one more question, but that's probably about as far as we need to go today. But unless somebody has a burning question. Mary Jane, do you have anything else?
I don't. I really appreciate you being here for another hour. And these guys, one of them was up till for our selectmen's meeting for 5 hours last night. So I'm impressed that hasn't got toothpicks for his to keep his eyelids up. So thank you very much for all being here. We have recorded this, and we recorded the one earlier. We're going to have our third discussion on housing in probably 3 or 4 weeks, and we're going to try to deal with a lot of zoning issues. And I don't know, we're just talking about. I'm just wondering if there's some of the other things that got brought up today. I'm hoping to add to that too. So we'll see what we have, but. I want to get all your names so we can, if you'd like, that we can send you the information, but it'll also be on our website. MCED has a website, and we'll put the Zoom information on that so that you can look on there and hop into the Zoom meeting if you like. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the developers being here, and great questions from the very faithful 6 or 7 folks we have here that showed up after 5 o'clock. So thank you so much. And I hope to meet you all again. And I feel like I owe a big debt of gratitude for Rebecca and Brian and Colin. It's been great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for
Pleasure
having
talking
us.
to all of you. Thank you.
Really great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.